Hi, and welcome to the joint launch of Brotherhood to Nationhood and Warrior Life, brought to you by Fernwood Publishing and Between the Lines. My name is Oyenda, and I'm the Publicity and Promotions Manager for Fernwood Publishing. It is an honor to be gathered here virtually in the midst of powerhouses and game changers. To start us off, I'd like to acknowledge that Fernwood is situated on, and I'm calling today from Treaty 1 territory, the land of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, Dene, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We as Fernwood, and I as Oyenda, respect the treaties that were made here and honor the original caretakers of the lands upon which we live and work on. We acknowledge the colonial violence and harm perpetuated in the past and recognize that it is ongoing continu- it's continually ongoing into the present. We dedicate ourselves to healing our relationship with the stewards of this land and moving forward in spirit of reconciliation. Just as we're about to start, do know there's going to be a question and answer section later where we're going to be answering questions that were left by the audience in our previous live stream. So do stay tuned for that. I'll be handing over to Dave from BTL Books, our co-organizers who will be introducing the speakers.
Thanks so much, Oyenda. And thanks to Fernwood for co-hosting. This is a really exciting event. I'm glad that we're doing this. And I'm calling in from Toronto, Dish with One Spoon territory. And yeah, I'm going to introduce the speakers, and then we'll get right into the questions. So today we are joined by Pam Palmater, the author of Warrior Life. Pam is a Mi'kmaq lawyer, professor, and chair in Indigenous governance at Ryerson University. And she's also the author of Indigenous Nationhood and Beyond Blood. Doreen Manuel, Secwepemc and Tunaja, comes from a long line of Indigenous oral historians and factual storytellers. She is an award-winning filmmaker and educator and principal owner of Running Wolf Productions and the director of the Bosa Center for Film and Animation at Capilano University. Kanahus Manuel, also Secwepemc and Tunaja, is a member of the Secwepemc Women's Warrior Society and a leader with the Tiny House Warriors, a grassroots group of Indigenous Secwepemc land defenders resisting the Kinder Morgan pipeline in British Columbia. She is the granddaughter of George Manuel. And I should also say that Doreen is the daughter of George Manuel, who we'll be talking about today. And Peter McFarlane is an author, journalist, and editor. His books include Northern Shadows, Canadians in Central America, Ancient Land, Ancient Sky, following Canada's native canoe routes. He's also worked on Unsettling Canada and the Reconciliation Manifesto with Art Manual. And yeah, so those are our speakers. And so to start us off, Pam, I'd like to ask you two questions. First, can you tell us about how and why your book Warrior Life came together? And second, you wrote the preface to Brotherhood, or you wrote a preface to Brotherhood to Nationhood. Can you tell us about why you were so keen to write that preface?
Well, thanks very much for having me. Kwe Nindaluizi, Pam Palmater. I'm from the sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation on unceded Mi'kmaqi territory. But today I'm coming to you from the sovereign territory of Mississaugas of Scugog. And I'm really honored to be part of the book, my book, also George Manuel's book, and to be here with the Manuel family, and of course, Fernwood and BTL. Thank you for having me. How my book came about was really almost like a part two to the first book, Indigenous Nationhood, Empowering Grassroots Citizens, because that first book was really about trying to encourage people to exercise their voices, even if it's unpopular, even if people don't like it, but exercising your voice for the purpose of providing warning and information and analysis to our people on the ground about things that are happening, because we all can't keep our eyes and minds on everything that's happening happening. And we know literally we're inundated with municipal governments, federal governments, provincial governments, and industry doing a lot of things at once. So if we're all exercising our voice in our areas, we can keep informed about these issues. Of course, it was written during the Harper era, the dreaded Harper era. And so this second book was really Fernwood saying, hey, why don't you do like a part 2 or a continuation during the Trudeau era, and really look at all of your writings and decide whether or not things have changed significantly since the Harper era. So that's what this next book is about. But in addition to exercising voice, it's also about putting everything that we know into action on the ground, like the Manuel family has been doing for multiple generations. And Kanahus is right in the middle of it right now. So it's looking at the Trudeau era and saying, look, we have this change in governors from conservative to liberal. Is everything magically better now? And while the rhetoric's changed, and rhetoric's important, what the big important issues haven't changed. They haven't given us our land back. They still don't respect our Aboriginal treaty and inherent rights. They don't respect our rights to be self-determining or make decisions. And so that was kind of what this book was really about, to provide that analysis so that people aren't, lost in the political propaganda. And that's really how this book came about, and also to focus on the warriors on the ground really doing this hard work that, we all need to be involved in some way. And from that, like during writing that second book, I got asked to write the foreword or the preface to this reiteration, this second edition of George Manuel's book. And first of all, I was honored by the request, but second of all, I was like, yes, because so often our people look to the future or look to some new solution, new idea, new technology that's going to be what saves us. When in fact, what this book shows is that even though it was written many years ago, it is just as relevant, if not more relevant today than when it was first written, because all of the lessons and strategies that were learned back then is exactly what we need now, because it's the raw truth. It's all the good, but it's also the bad. It's the things that we did right, things that we can improve. And that's how we need to act on the ground. We need to be strategic in our resistance. We need to be able to adapt, and we need to be able to learn from those lessons. And so I think that book, in fact, is more relevant today than ever. So of course I wanted to write the foreword to it, because it's such a rare book. I mean, where else do you see a book about an Indigenous leader that isn't just about painting a perfect picture, which isn't realistic for our people? Our people have lived through genocide and colonization and intergenerational trauma. We all have hardship and trauma and imperfect lives. And that's exactly what this book is about. You can still be a hero to our nations with the trauma and the suffering that we've had. And so this book is so inspiring, and you can tell I'm still really excited about it. And the second edition has so many other great things about it, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But that's one of the reasons this book exudes the warrior life in such a good way for our people.
Thanks so much. Wow, that is your energy is infectious, and I want to keep it moving and get to Peter. So, Peter, you first wrote Brotherhood to Nationhood in 1993, or it was published in '93. Can you tell us how this revised edition came into being and what it was like updating the story for today?
Well, first, I think I might go back a bit and tell you where the original book came from. And it really came through my friendship with Arthur Manuel, who I met in Montreal in the mid-1980s. I was just back from Central America. I was working on another book at the time. And at some point, Arthur suggested that I might consider doing a book on his father. And I certainly knew who George Manuel was at the time. I had written an article about him in 1980 for The Guardian. And at the time, George Manuel was really the leading force of the Indigenous movement in the world, actually. In the early 1970s, he'd taken over the National Indian Brotherhood, excuse me, the forerunner of the Assembly of First Nations. And he had built it into this amazing activist organization in Ottawa. And at the same time, he was the founding president of the World Council of Indigenous Peoples. So he brought together the indigenous peoples of North and South America, Australia, New Zealand, and Scandinavian Sami people in a single organization. And I think at the time he was nominated 3 times for Nobel Peace Prizes. And in the late 70s, he had gone back to British Columbia to launch what he called the People's Movement. And that was an amazing movement. It was like Idle No More on steroids, really. That hundreds of activists full-time engaging in all sorts of issues, the self-government issues, and the Constitutional Express. And I think Doreen can speak more on that. She was part of the movement as well as George Manuel's daughter. And so, of course, I was interested in writing the book. But unfortunately, George Manuel passed away in 1989 before I was able to start. So it was the following year, 1990, I went out to Nisconnet to meet with Bobby Manuel, who was George's oldest son. Bobby was a considerable politician himself. He had been, I think, within 2 votes of being elected National Chief of the Assembly First Nations. And I think at the time he was the head of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. And so he sat me down and he gave me a list. I must have been 24 names of people I would have to speak to as a part of the research of the book. And there were people who worked with George on different levels. It was some of the elders in the Sconlith. And I spent, I guess, about 3 years researching and writing it. And it was published, as you mentioned, 1993. So it was more than 25 years later that Between the Lines got in touch with me and said they were considering a new edition. And I was very happy with the idea that the George Manuel story would be available to a new generation. But the book also, I knew the book had certain flaws, it had some gaps, and it would really require the approval of the family to be republished. And so I contacted Doreen, and Doreen said, sure, yeah, do it. And more important, she said she would help on the rewriting of it, on the corrections of it, and filling in the gaps. And I think one of the biggest gaps was it did not give credit to the role of women in the movement. I mean, they were at the highest levels of George's organizations, but they really were the energy on the ground. The grassroots was really run by women. And again, this is something Doreen can speak about because she was part of that. So that was basically the origin of the 2 books. I'm very pleased to be part of the new edition because it's so much improved because of Doreen's role in it. And so I think she can take the story from there.
Yeah, Doreen, would you like to tell us about your experience working on this revised edition?
Yeah, I remember when the first edition was being written, and I read the galley proofs of it, and I noticed the absence of the woman's voice in that edition, and another a lot of things that troubled me about it. And when my sister Vera was going to meet with Peter, I gave her a long list of my notes. And a few of the notes made it into the book, particularly about how Mom and Dad met, because I was with Dad when he told me that story about their meeting at the Kokolitsa hospital. And I told Vera the story, and she told Peter, and that part wound up in the book. But I think, at that point, the book had already pretty much been written. And so there were very few of the changes that I had pointed out included in that first edition. So I was excited when Peter suggested we republish it, because especially when he was so interested in having the corrections made and the additions made. So it felt like a real partnership, and I was really happy to be involved with that part of the evolution of this publishing. People like my dad, like George Manuel, it's important to realize that our Indigenous history and history makers like George Manuel are not included in school education for our youth. Yet this sort of information is vital to our people to recognize the role models who paved the way to our existence today. Knowing this history is important to the development of our identity, our young people's identity. It's also important to build upon the already proven solutions and to learn from the past mistakes. And yet most modern day leaders don't take the time to learn the history. That's why it's important to me that we write about the history. We offer to them. It's from George Manuel's words himself, and then from Peter being there during that era, capturing that important knowledge from Bob and Arthur and from the other people that he interviewed. It's vital for us to really examine that, because you watch non-Indigenous politicians, they look at their history and they build upon. They don't reinvent the wheel every time a new leader comes in. And that's what we should be doing. We should be building upon what's already been done. And we're not doing that. When you see these chiefs that get into the national position, they just seem to go off on their own little path. They have their own little agenda they're already trying to accomplish. They're not looking at the bigger picture. And we've gotten ourselves into a real situation now, because no one's looking at the really bigger picture and willing to make the kind of sacrifices that leaders like George Manuel made and were willing to make. No one's going out into the international arena the way he did with this. Somebody asked me recently, how did George Manuel unite the people of the world? What they thought looked so easy. And it's because he lived by a very simple set of values. It's difficult to live by those values. They're easy to state. You hear a lot of leaders stating off our values, but it's difficult to live by them. And he lived by them. And when you met him, you knew you were meeting somebody really genuine, somebody who didn't want to stay in fancy hotels, didn't want to drive a fancy car, just wanted to care about the people. And everything that he did and every decision he made, he based it on one very solid but simple foundation of every decision has to be made with the thought of the children who are yet unborn. How is this going to affect those children? And when you live by that value, other people who respect that value gravitate towards you. So he was this magnet, this energy magnet, and people could feel it. And so when he traveled the world, the people would feel it and they would come to him and they would be motivated and inspired by that. And they too, their light would be ignited and they would become part of that energy that traveled throughout the world.
Wow. It's powerful. It's powerful hearing you talk about it, and in the book, reading him traveling around and talking to leaders in different parts of the world. Doreen, I want to ask you another question, and then I'll ask Kanahus the same. In preparation for this event, we were talking about the title of Pam's book, Warrior Life. How do you see warrior life as it relates to your father, George Manuel, and his family, and how it relates today?
When I think of a warrior, I think of somebody who lives by those values, thinking about the children yet unborn. My dad used to tell me when I went out to work for the band, for my band, he told me, just always remember every single dime that they pay you to work for our people, every single dime that is administered out to provide services to our people, it belongs to every man, woman, and child and baby yet unborn. So you work hard. You work 10 times harder than you would if you worked anywhere else. You give everything you've got, and you don't ever take a long break. You don't ever show up late. You don't ever leave early. You just work, because that's what you owe to our people. So he raised us with these values of thinking about our future, protecting the land, protecting the environment, and things like, things people never think about, like don't go into debt. Because if you're in debt and you owe money to mortgage for your house and car payment for your car and credit cards, and all of a sudden you lose your job, or you're at threat of losing your job because you've been too outspoken, it's too easy for the settlers to shut you down because you're so scared of losing that material. He said, if you're going to get those things, be willing to give it up tomorrow. If it got to that, let it go, because that's how they get you. They get you thinking like an individual. They get you thinking about the material wealth and appreciating and wanting those things, those comforts. And they hook you in to that corporate kind of greed and power. But warriors, you have to be able to sacrifice everything tomorrow. Sacrifice your life, and not just your physical life, this life I'm holding in my body right now, but your life, the everything that's in your life, not your children, but I mean everything else that's in your life, like hopes and dreams, thoughts of, yeah, maybe I want to be, whatever, a veterinarian or something. And maybe that'll come true, but maybe it won't. Like my brother Bob had wanted to be a mechanic, but he had leadership skill in him, and Dad saw that. So Dad honed it. Bobby had a really full life. He loved what he did. He came to enjoy it. But he did have another hope that was there, another thought that was there. But that warrior life took over him, and he embodied it, and he became it, and he stepped up to the line to fight for his people. To me, a warrior, and they can fight in so many different ways, in so many different fields. Like Dad told us, pick a field. It doesn't have to all be in politics, but politics lives in every single thing that there is. So you're going to be political no matter what you choose. But pick something, and whatever it is, whether it's in law or activism or medicine or media, you become a warrior and a leader in that stream, and you do everything you can using those tools to help your people. That's all being part of, a warrior. I think people think warrior is somebody who always stands on the front line, but that's one type of warrior. And then there's so many others who support that one who's standing on those ones that are standing on the line.
Thank you. Kanahus, we haven't heard from you yet, and I know people want to hear from you what warrior life means to you, and in terms of the legacy of your grandfather, and also the work you're doing today on the front lines.
Yeah, warrior life to me means exactly everything that my Auntie Doreen said. My grandpa George, he passed away when I was a teenager, and my father is Arthur Manuel, and so Doreen is my auntie, and him and my father, younger sister, and I was raised by my father and my mother at Naskaunath and within our territory in Sukwat and was able to enjoy our territory and a lot of our culture and traditions, like picking huckleberries, just being out onto the territory. One of the memorable things about my life is in my childhood is visiting our great grandmother on our Tanaka side. So we're both Secwepemc and Tanaka, and really influenced by both the Tanaka and the Secwepemc culture. My grandfather, George Manuel, has always been an inspiration to us as his grandchildren, and just knowing that he was a sound leader, he was a respected leader from around the world, and we knew that, we grew up with that, knowing that so much people around the world, Indigenous leaders and Indigenous people, grassroots people, adored him and loved that there was a leader of his kind, because so much people aren't born with those leadership skills. And so my first memories is when I was 4.5 years old, and we were on the Constitution Express with my mother and my twin sister, who's also same age, and my younger brother, who was I think 5 or 6 months or so. He was just a young baby on the train. And for those that don't know, the Constitution Express, traveled all across the country from the West Coast all the way to Ottawa, to fight for our rights, for our Indigenous title and rights. And I was always taught that my grandfather George Manuel put Aboriginal title and rights on the table. And being a warrior to me is fighting for those rights and those actual land rights to the land. And it's not just rights to pick berries or fish, it's actual title to the land. And that's what I believe, just being raised in this family, that my role is as a warrior, because it's continuing on the work that my grandfather did, my uncles and my aunties, my grandmothers, all of my relatives did to fight for our land. And like my Auntie Doreen said, we have to know our history in order to not make those same mistakes. Like they put a lot of groundwork in to even be where we're at right now, where I'm at here at the Tiny House Warriors, stopping this pipeline. Before, when people even left the reserve, they needed a pass, they would get arrested. So we've come a long way where we could actually take land back to oppose and stop a pipeline construction. So warrior life means that to me, and just thinking for being able to be here on this panel with everybody, all you
Th-
warriors.
Thanks. For people who aren't familiar, could you say a bit more about the Tiny House Warriors and what you're up to?
Yeah, the Tiny House Warriors. Okay, the Tiny House Warriors is a mission to stop the Trans Mountain Pipeline, and we are building 10 tiny houses on wheels that are being launched throughout our territory. The Trans Mountain Pipeline is a bitumen pipeline that will transport bitumen from Edmonton, from the Alberta tar sands to the Edmonton terminal to the West Ridge Marine Terminal in Burnaby. And 518 kilometers of this 1,000 plus kilometer pipeline goes through Secwepemc. The original one was built in 1953, and this twin pipeline will triple the capacity, and it'll increase the tanker size in and around Vancouver and the inlets by 7-fold. And so it's a massive project that Canada has purchased this pipeline from a Texas oil giant, Kinder Morgan. And right now we are battling them, not just on the ground by stopping this man camp that we believe we've been successful in stopping, because they haven't built this 1,000-man camp yet, and it's the pipeline workers. And so we're on the ground here. We've been here. This is the third winter. And just thank everybody for continuing to support.
Wow, thank you. And we'll definitely post the links to how you can support the Tiny House Warriors as well for everyone watching. Pam, what's coming up for you when in all this talk of warrior life?
Well, it's really about all of the work that our people are doing and have been doing since contact, in terms of, this balance between resistance and resurgence. So if you look at any of the warriors on the ground, you look at Kanahus, you look at the Wet'suwet'en, you look at Haudenosaunee, Mi'kmaq peoples, you've got very visible warriors on the ground engaging in a particular purpose, protecting land and or water and or whatever their particular rights are. But you also have all of the warriors around them, the ones who are helping to take care of their families in the interim, or providing supplies, or providing much needed research and data, or media releases, or websites, or GoFundMe pages. And then all of the people who are then on another concentric circle outside of that who are engaging in educational information to make sure that people know what's happening, organizing, strategizing, fundraising. I mean, it literally takes thousands of us to support warriors on the ground. And I think that's the most important thing about warrior life that people don't understand. They think if they're not the person on the ground, that there's no role for them. But oh my goodness, it is just as important to be at home taking care of the kids of someone who is on the ground as it is for the person who is, doing that frontline work. And, I echo what everybody has said, obviously. And the thing about warrior life, you can point to people like George Manuel. He was a man, he was a warrior that we needed urgently at that time. Canada had so many plans with its white paper and everything else to just get rid of us, get rid of the last recognition of us as peoples with our rights, our lands, and everything else. And he stepped up. He might have been an imperfect person, as we all are. He might have made mistakes in his life, like we all have, but he stood up and said, I'm going to do this for my people in my imperfect way. But that's what warriors do. They focus on the purpose, the bigger picture. It's not, about them, and they don't make it about them. And I think he's the kind of leader that, the old school warriors who made it about the cause that seems to be missing in a lot of areas. And for him, you think about a person who had come from a place of trauma. Think of all the intergenerational trauma of residential schools and all of Canada's genocidal policies, struggling to find your path, struggling to do right by your family, by your community, by all of the other First Nations in this country, constantly in this struggle to do right, making lots of mistakes, good decisions, bad decisions. I'm sure was criticized all of the time, celebrated at the same time. But at the end of the day, he was a warrior and a hero for our people. And I can say that even though I'm not from Secwepemc territory, I'm from Mi'kma'ki, because of the work he did at the national stage and the international stage. And that's what warrior life is all about. It wasn't just about him or his focus. And and the thing is he passed that down, to Art and Doreen and all of their relatives. And you can see that. Because look at what Kanahus does today. And she didn't just happen into that. That comes from a long history of teachings, of watching, of understanding that to be a warrior, it's not about being a saint. I mean, and if people think that you have to be perfect and have never made a mistake or said anything out of turn or done anything out of turn or make money, then you're out. Well, then there's a really short lineup over to the left for people who want to sign up for sainthood. But the rest of us have to be engaged in standing up for our nations, because quite honestly, if sovereignty is about living, asserting, and defending your land, your territory, your people, your identity, your collective, it's not a right. And if you're not out on the land defending it, if you're not out in political forums and legal forums internationally defending it, well, then we won't have it. So we should all be so inspired and thankful by the people who are making that sacrifice, because it is a sacrifice. We don't often talk about it, but it is 100% commitment. Your entire life is committed to it, regardless of whether people like you or don't like you or attack you or try to malign you, or government does the whole divide and conquer and try to incorporate, doubt and all of that. The warriors who keep doing it anyway, oh, thank goodness for that, because that means we'll still be sitting here sovereign on our territories. When all of this has passed, we were the first ones here and we will be the last ones standing. And I think George Manuel's book and his life and his family and all of those values are so needed today, because as the government gets more money and more powerful, we have to show them that, they're lacking the critical power, which is our indigeneity and our warriors that are here today. And it's just, the book is just so full of that. It's so full of honesty, and it creates a place. It shows our youth, yeah, there's a place for you. And never mind about your mistakes, and never mind about things that have happened, because this is the warrior lineup. This isn't the perfect people lineup, of which we know doesn't exist. And I think our youth need to see that, because if we keep presenting that you can only be a leader, you can only be a hero if you're perfect, then we won't have any. And this book says, welcome aboard. This is the place for warriors who've suffered trauma, who've been colonized, who've survived genocide, and we all have a collective purpose. And nothing can inspire you more than that kind of manual warrior life value.
Wow.
I just want to say that there were less people back in the day that criticized George Manuel because he lived by a set of values that were taught to him by his grandparents. His grandparents were both medicine people. His grandma was a herbologist medicine woman, and his grandpa was a physical medicine man. And there's been this shift of colonization. Like, colonization has really captured our people. That whole concept I talked about earlier about individuality and that corporate mindset of money and materialism has really taken over so many of our people. Back in 1969, when Trudeau introduced that white paper policy, just before that, there was a lot of discussion all across Canada with all the tribes, because the government was going to start offering services money to them. I asked my mother what it was like for Indigenous people in Canada when the what do you call that, when the repression happened. And she said, "What is that? When was it?" And I told her, and she said, "Oh, we didn't have that. Indigenous people were self-sufficient. We grew all our own food. We hunted our own food. We fished. So if money was removed, it didn't affect us because we had no money anyways." And then they had all this discussion. And in fact, that 1969 meeting that happened in Kamloops was one of the very first meetings in all of Canada that received government funding. They received a little bit. Most of the money was fundraised by Rose Charlie and women like that, my mother, people like that were fundraising. But a little bit came. And after that, more money came. So that's when that whole welfare mentality started to come in, and the government specifically put it into our community, because if you just appease people enough, they'll stay calm. You give them too little or nothing, that's when they rise up. So there was a whole generations of people who were like my dad all across Canada. There were the Cardinals in Alberta, I forget his name, the chief of Hobbema Reserve, the Tatusises, you name people all across Canada that were part of that early movement. And they all had those same values my dad had. So when he was coming up in politics, and they had children like me, who they were raising the way dad raised me, with those values. And so we were all coming up, and even though I'm a residential school survivor, I wound up in residential school for a while because my mom was, her health was failing and dad couldn't manage with us all. So even though I was in there, as soon as I came out, I was back immersed into my culture. My mom sent me to live with my grandma for a while to get healed and to work on myself. Even though we suffered, my generation, we were still raised with those values. But you have mom and dad were both survivors, and I'm a survivor. And then our kids are coming up, third generation survivors. So in a lot of ways, there was a shift that's happened now. And it's like the government has captured more of our people. Plus there was that whole 60s scoop, and it continued. They call it the 60s scoop, but it's still going on today. And with so many kids in care not getting those teachings that dad gave us, that were given to my generation of kids, you have these people coming up that really just care about surviving, money, getting by, becoming wealthy, and personally self-sufficient, and they're not really thinking about our people. Plus, with the limited housing on reserves, there's only up to 50% living on reserve today. So those that go live off reserve, they're living in an environment that really feeds that whole individuality perception and identity. So you have way more people criticizing the leadership, the grassroots leadership like Kanahus. People that attack her are people that want greed. They're greedy. They want something for themselves. And so they'll nitpick every little thing about her. I think some of our leadership needs to be nitpicked, like the current national chief and people like that. I would say they're too flawed. There's a level of being flawed. I mean, there's, my dad actually, because he lived by those very simple principles, nobody could accuse him of being greedy. Nobody could accuse him of taking something before somebody else. Nobody could accuse him of some of the things that some of our chiefs are being accused of today. So there was less accusation. And I've heard people in my own family say, living up to the manual values is too hard. I don't want to have to do it. I want to go do my own thing and hurt the land and live off of the environment and kill Mother Earth. I want to go do those things. And I don't want my manual side of my family telling me what to do. And they say that kind of thing. And I think, I don't think it's hard. I don't think it's hard to find my way into a profession where I can still support my family and not hurt the earth. I don't think that's difficult. But for the younger ones who didn't get the teachings the way we did, didn't get that ingrained in us, it's hard for them. And I've been really examining that and knowing that our kids need that education. Dad used to say, laborers get trained in public school. Public schools train laborers. Private schools train leaders. Unless your kids are going to public school, when they come home, you provide them the supplementary education. And that's what he did. He provided that supplementary education. It was about our identity, making us strong inside of ourselves and making us need to help our people like we need air, like we need oxygen, making it part of our biology. And that's what our younger kids are missing. That's why it's so vitally important for me. One time I was in a workshop with Elenisa Bomsawin, and she said, we got to get our people in that box. And she was pointing at a television set, because our kids are growing up learning from that box. And if we're not in that box, they're learning everybody else's culture and they're becoming like everybody else. They're not becoming like us. And that's why I work in media. I'm getting our people into the box. I'm affecting that. And Dad used to say, we got to be part of media, because at the time in the 70s, when we were coming up as warriors, we were begging the Vancouver Sun and CBC to cover our stories, just like we kind of are today still. Because we didn't have any Indigenous writers in Vancouver or anywhere else that I lived, or news people. So we were begging them to cover our stories and hoping that they would cover it well. And sometimes they did, and sometimes they didn't. Today, we have way more of our own people covering the news. One of the first reporters from CBC that went up to Skokwalwal to cover the story there with Kanahus and Mayuk and the others that were up there was Duncan McHugh, who's Anishinaabe. And he did a brilliant story. And Dad used to say, we need to have our people in every realm of everything, because we need our voices heard. I'll leave it there.
Kanahus or Pam, do you have anything to add to what Doreen was saying there?
Oh, no.
Cool. Doreen, I actually wanted to ask one other question, which is, Pam was talking about, not everyone needs to be in the spotlight, and there's lots of work to do behind the scenes, and not everyone's sort of, in the national political role. Could you tell us a bit more about some of the work that was happening that women were doing around George Manuel, and some of it's in the book, and I really encourage people to read the book. But I'm interested in your perspective of some of the work you were doing. You've talked about organizing like giant rallies, and some of the other work that women were doing that was really essential that sometimes didn't get quite the media coverage that it deserved.
Well, Dad always believed in having foot soldiers. We used to call ourselves the foot soldiers. He would train a group of people about what the issues were, the important things that everybody had to know. Because back in the day, he used to do it. And he would go out and even horseback ride into a community. Like Mount Currie had only a train that went up near Mount Currie, up by Pemberton. But from Pemberton to Mount Currie, there was no roads. There was horse trails. So he would come in on a train, get off, and somebody'd be waiting there with a couple horses, and he'd get on a horse and he'd ride into Mount Currie, and he'd stay there for a week because the train only came one way 1 week and the other way the following week. He'd stay there for a whole week educating the people. And then after a while, he started training people to do that work. And so there were these people that would travel all throughout British Columbia, because even in the 70s, not everybody owned a phone. And when Dad was starting, next to no one owned a phone. So you couldn't just phone somebody and tell them what was going on. You actually had to go there. So I remember Rosie Tisha saying one time, they were traveling up north and they were on such a deadline. Her little boy was with her. Her little boy was the same age as my little boy. And they couldn't even stop for bathroom breaks. So she wasn't drinking anything or eating anything. She was just driving. And he needed to go pee. And she gave him an empty apple juice bottle and said, "Pee in here." We were all joking about that. That's the life of a warrior, man. You got to be somewhere. You got to be somewhere. But women were the fundraisers and the grassroots organizers, like my mom and people like that in Dad's early days. That's what the women would plan all the, because there, like I said, there was no government money. And he'd have to get to Saskatchewan because they often met like halfway across Canada, and he'd have to get there somehow. And he'd need a train ticket, and he'd need food money. And when I'm talking about food money, I mean like nothing like the food money leaders get today. I mean, it was like $1 or something a day to, just to have at least something to eat on the road. And the women would raise that money. My mom she used to tan hides and make gloves, and then they would have bingos and dinners and different things like that. And it would just raise just enough money, or they'd pass the hat and everybody would throw in whatever they could afford. And as the time passed, the women retained that role, but they also started growing into other roles, like being foot soldiers, or like, Marie Maruli was Dad's right hand with the National Indian Brotherhood, and he would send her down to other countries, in South and Central America. I sent her to Africa to do some of the ground work for him. Like he had already broken the ground, but she would go in and follow up, and that's why when he gave up his position with the World Council, eventually she was one of the people who moved into the World Council to help keep it going. And then she was one of the people who started the World Education Council. And then people and you see those women that stayed doing things like Rosa Letizia and Millie Poplar, and, these different women that continued that work. So, they ran the Concerned Aboriginal Women's Movement, which I bet you nobody's ever heard of, but it was the Concerned Aboriginal Women's Movement who attacked the Ministry of, it's called the Ministry of Children and Family today, but I mean, it was over the 60s scoop. Those women just went in full force. We were at Grace McCarthy's house, and we protested and demonstrated right at her house, demanding changes to the child welfare system, and we got the changes. And we rolled that into the Concerned Aboriginal Women's Movement that took over the Department of Indian Affairs and demanded better housing and better opportunities for education. And then it was that group of women who rolled into and became the Constitution Express. So it's, it's kind of, I don't think it was ever a strategy that we talked about, but it was a smart strategy, not keeping the same name forever. When you look at the West Coast Warriors, they got attacked and just pounded down by the police and the government. But we kept changing our name. And so we were like, oh, we're a brand new movement now. No, we're not that movement. We're this one now. And so they would be getting ready to attack the child caravan. And we weren't the child caravan anymore. We were now the Concerned Aboriginal Women's Movement. Oh, we're not the Concerned Aboriginal Movement anymore. We're the Constitution Express. And we just kept changing names. So when I was fighting the First Nations Governance Act, we were the grassroots movement. And my sister asked me to keep that name and grow it into an actual organization. And I said, no, I'm not going to give them an opportunity to attack us. So I just let it go. But yeah, women have just been such a strong part of it. And one time, my brother Art, when he was still, Kanahus doesn't even know this story. When he was still drinking, Bob was trying to get me involved in organizing something. And Arthur said, we don't need those women. What the heck do they know how to do? And I just said, yeah, you're right. You're right. We don't know how to do nothing. Yeah, I'm just going to go home. And I just told my sisters, that's it. We do nothing for them until they learn respect. And Bob already knew. He already knew how much he put on us. And they couldn't get anything done because nobody was raising any money. And they were just ended everything just right there and then. And finally, Bob called me up in the middle of the night and talked me into it. And I came back and raised the money for him. I think you have to do that sometimes as a woman. You have to just teach them a lesson about how much you actually do, because I think they just take it for granted sometimes. Sometimes when you get all wrapped up in the movement of leadership and you don't actually realize where the money is coming from.
Wow, that's a great story, and great fortitude to make that happen. Pam, I wanted to ask you a question. So George Manuel's life and the book really focus a lot on Pierre Elliott Trudeau, and your book is a lot about Justin Trudeau, the son. And so I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the parallels between them and what's changed or what hasn't changed from Trudeau to Trudeau.
Wow. Well, ultimately, I don't think a lot has changed because our core issue is with these settler governments, not necessarily political parties. But one thing I will notice, and that I'm actually quite thankful for, is that, if Pierre Elliott Trudeau's legacy is Justin Trudeau, well, then I'm very thankful that George Manuel and Art Manuel's legacy is Kanahus Manuel, because every time you see the Manuel family and others meet them toe to toe on every issue. So, Justin Trudeau thought, oh, I'll just buy the pipeline and then nobody can say anything. Yeah, well, Tiny House Warriors has a lot to say about it, and so do a whole lot of other Native people. And so, for every impediment, for every barrier, for every politician that works against us, we have warriors to meet the challenge. And I think people need to see that, honor it, and celebrate it more, because if we only show, how awful these politicians are in terms of their intentions, and there is no doubt now. I mean, the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls did finding of fact and an independent legal assessment and concluded, that based on fact and law, Canada is guilty of both historic and ongoing genocide. And to be guilty of genocide, you have to have intention. You can't mistakenly genocide people. So the debate over intention is over. So Pierre Elliott Trudeau intended to and did engage in acts of genocide, just like the current prime minister does, just like provincial prime minister or premiers do. And that is the reality. So they might package it differently. I mean, former Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper was very, I would say he was racist, he was aggressive, he was dismissive, he was, very obviously that party was anti-First Nations. And then, the Liberal Party comes in and there's no relationship more important than the one with Indigenous peoples, nation to nation, respect for your rights. I will ensure that free, prior, and informed consent means a veto. And he confirmed that on national TV. And where are we today? Buying pipelines against the will of First Nations. And so ultimately, we have to look at all of that and be able to deconstruct it and say, yeah, the rhetoric's changed. That's good, because we don't need a prime minister continuing to perpetuate hate. But if they're not giving the land back, if they're not respecting our rights, and primarily our right to be self-determining, sovereign in our own territories with our own laws, then what has fundamentally changed? And not a whole lot has fundamentally changed on their part. And all I am saying is that thank goodness that the manual values haven't changed either, and that they're inspiring other people to stand up and resist. Because every time something negative happens to us, we stand up and resist. And we have to celebrate every little bit of success. So every day that a pipeline is delayed, that's a success. That's a battle that we've won, and we need to celebrate that instead of, what the government wants us to think. Oh, it's too big. It's too overwhelming. We'll never be able to stop it. That's not what matters. The warriors on the ground are involved in a day-to-day battle. You won that one court case, great. You stopped them today, great. You won them in the media today, great. Every one of those are battles that we need to celebrate. Like what was happening in George Manuel's time, in Art Manuel's time. And to me, that is what's really fundamental, because like in my book Warrior Life, yeah, I make the really depressing argument that reconciliation is a lie. It's a total lie. That's not at all what's happened under Trudeau. But on the flip side, I also say that we have lots to be hopeful for, because hope and is in our resistance, and that people are still resisting it and challenging it and calling it out. And that's really hopeful. And so I think between Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Justin Trudeau, they might not have changed a whole lot, but thank goodness we haven't either, and we'll be there to meet them on the ground every single time, because of families like the Manuel family and many other families across this country who have held on to our Indigenous values and are here to protect the land, because it's not just for us, it's for the whole, it's literally for the whole planet. And, Canadians, Americans, and others, thank goodness they're rallying behind us, because they see there is no future unless you support this side of the battle, which is about Indigenous land and protecting the ecosystems and the planets for everybody, and literally about human rights and safety. So that's my assessment of the Trudeaus. They have been and continue to be matched quite admirably by the Manuels.
Wow. Some fire from Pam. Love it. We're going to move to a few questions from the audience, but I do want to encourage the speakers that if you have thoughts from things that were said recently, to also add those in when you're responding. One question that we got in a few different iterations from the audience, a question that often comes up is what can settlers do to support? And the two iterations of this were, what can people do to support specifically warriors, and also movements for land back. And Kanahus, we haven't heard from you in a little while. I was wondering if you had thoughts on things that settlers can do to support. Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I see a lot of people saying now is about the land acknowledgement, and I agree that people need to just give the land back. They need to, like, all these settlers that have large tracts of land need to give it back to the Indigenous people whose territory they're on. And that's the way that we want land acknowledgements done from now on. But that's like where we need to be heading as Indigenous people and settler relationship. And we always say that we need money to be able to fight the system. And so we're always accepting donations on the front lines through our website, tinyhousewarriors.com, and other movements that always fundraising constantly for just the frontline work. And too, the legal battle is a big battle too. So even supporting us, being sharing our stuff. I think I should put this in because the puppies are um, making a bunch of noise here. But could you hear me good?
Yes, yes. The
Okay.
adorable puppies we can't hear so much.
Okay. Yeah, and that there's a lot of skills for people to give. One thing that we ask everybody is to ask themselves is, what skills do you have to offer the movement, or where you're actually living and occupying? If you're living here in so-called Canada, you're actually occupying somebody's Indigenous territories, and there's ways that you can help and contribute to those movements in those territories, whether it's the movements through culture, language, land back, land defense, film, like my Auntie Doreen said. There's all different ways for people to support Pam's podcasts. Like, she's constantly needing to get this information out to us because we're constantly just eager to hear it. Like, so a lot of ways to support. The skills that people have to offer. Everyone in here living in this land is actually making their money off of our land, whether you're a doctor, a lawyer, a scientist, or any type of profession, you're making it off of native land. And my father always told us that as we're growing up, and he would say, yeah, that lawyer, that doctor's office, everything that you see, they're making it off of your land. So you have to give back. That's what, like, this mutual aid and this movement of mutual aid where you're giving back to movements. I constantly in my social media feeds are seeing Indigenous youth raising funds just for survival, but a lot of Indigenous youth are doing frontline work, amazing work, like shutting down billionaires' homes that are constructing pipelines in West Vancouver, like amazing work that need to be supported as well. And that's, like, I think is part of our work as the Manuel family too, is people are always looking at us for our political analysis and our leadership. So it's not like we can just willy-nilly make decisions. We actually really think about our decisions. We discuss it with our family, with everybody in our movements, the friends and colleagues that my father had around him. I still communicate with them today. So for advice, for just to have a voice that was really close to my father. What do you think my father would do? How would he react? And even with my Auntie Doreen, how would Grandpa George respond to this? And so we're constantly looking at the way that our family reacted to different things, learn from them, but also discuss on how we're going to go forward. And so people need to know when they're supporting movements to really do background check too. Usually in the movement, in Indigenous movements, it's generations, so you can go back if it's how long they've been fighting. So if some name just pops up and someone tells me, oh, do you know this person, this Mohawk person, I will contact back to my contacts in Mohawk territory to confirm this person is legit. So we have contacts like that all throughout. And so when you're supporting movements as settlers, make sure that you really know that these are the legitimate movements, because there's been pretendians, as people are calling them, that are just pretending to be Indians and pretending to be leaders in our movement, and they're not. So yeah, make sure that you're supporting the right movements.
Yeah, good point. Doreen, I'm interested in what you would say to settlers who are looking to support warriors and the land back movement.
First, I would say make sure that the support you're giving is supporting and not trying to take a position, not trying to be a spokesperson, but rather offering your support to what's already there. And if nothing is there, then supporting the growth and development of it, but staying in the back seat, because this is our movement. And part of that movement forward is our own volition, has to be our own volition. Because that's our empowerment. The time of colonization and being a savior is gone. It's done. No more saviors. We need to do this ourselves. And for our own people, educating any settler who thinks they're going to take that role and helping push them back and explain to them where their position needs to be. And just to add on to what Kanahus said about land back, a lot of people will their estates to charities. Indigenous people, you could will it just as easily to Indigenous people, to one of the Indigenous organizations, or if you were to approach a group like Tiny House Warriors, they would talk and discuss about the land that you are capable of returning and figure out the best way to return it, because it gets complicated because that land is in somebody else's territory. Then there needs to be a bit of discussion about how that will go and where it should go back to. But there are so many people that own land in British Columbia that is our territory and our land, and we're not being treated fairly by the British Columbia government. They're doing so many evil things. They're taking all the resources out of that, every piece of land they could possibly take, or else they're selling off lots of land in parcels to developers. Like this was particularly happening up at Sun Peaks in the Skokotwalt. They were selling off these huge lots of land to developers, and developers were parceling it off into little lots and selling that for crazy amounts of money and making tons and tons of money. Well, that land they were giving away to these developers was our territory that hasn't even been settled in comprehensive land claims process yet. The entire province is partaking in that sort of behavior. So the more land that we can get back, we on our reservations, we don't even own enough land to be self-sufficient because the reservations are too small. And this is the case all across Canada. So, land is economy, and we need to gain back as much of that land as possible. That's why you hear this saying so loud right now, land back, because our people are realizing this exact point. Yeah, that's all I'll say for now.
Great, thanks. Peter, I'm interested in your perspective on this question as someone who has been in a supportive role and has been involved in media for a long time. What sort of role do you see for settlers, or how have you navigated this question?
Well, one thing is the original book had been written today. It probably, no doubt, would have been written by an Indigenous person. That was 30 years ago. And as Doreen was pointed out, there just weren't that many Indigenous writers. And so it was natural for Art to look around to a friend and somebody who could trust to do the book. But of course, today it would be one of many wonderful Indigenous writers doing it. So that's obviously a big change. I guess an illustration of that too is when Art was doing his book with Grand Chief Derrickson. He called me to be an editor, and they were already working on the draft. They had it almost done, and so they wanted somebody, as they were not professional writers, to come in as an editor. So that was the difference. So the role of today would be as an editor, and maybe that's more symbolic as well. It's in the background. It's to contribute a skill. But the driver's seat, the writers were Art and Grand Chief Derrickson. So yeah, I think that's the necessary evolution. And if a settler wants to be in the driver's seat, well, there's no place there. There's already many capable drivers. Some people need some support, some technical help, but the world is completely different than 30 years ago in very good ways.
Yeah, I agree. Pam, we're coming to you. What do you see as the role for settlers?
Well, I think this is my favorite question, and I always hope that somebody asks it at every event, because think about settlers. They have the numbers, they have the education, they have the wealth, and they have the influence to force governments to do just about anything. Think about it. Like, that's who governments tailor all of their policies to. That's who, I mean, think about them. They're the electors. They're the ones that have all of the power to force governments to do things. So all they have to do is wield that power wherever they are. And so it's not just in politics. So it's not just in terms of voting, but it's also in terms of, you know, are you sitting on a health board? And are you in the position to make decisions on health and health policy? Are you in an educational board? You know, are you in industry where you can be making better decisions? So there's a lot of things that settlers can be doing in their own realm. But in terms of very specifically with Indigenous peoples, they can help carry the load. And the question isn't, you know, what can I do for you? It should be turned around so that the settler is the one saying, well, what do I have to offer? And that's part of carrying the load. Are you a researcher? Can you provide research assistance? Are you an IT person? Can you help design a website and maintain it? Do you have access to wealth, or can you fundraise? Then you can contribute that way. Are you someone who, you know, has, you know, extra supplies in terms of, you know, food and clothing and things that are needed on the ground? When these things, like, there are literally a million things you can think of anybody, and there is some skill or some thing that they can offer to the cause, in addition to land back, and making sure that it goes back to their rightful heirs. And I would just echo some of the things that you know, Doreen was saying, that be careful to be a respectful, supportive ally, and not a I know what's best for you savior. Because sometimes you might hear an article, it might be written by an Indigenous person, and say, yeah, well, that's what should happen. And then go about trying to impose that, as opposed to understanding that we are not all one big, one mythical race of Indians. We're Secwepemc and Mi'kmaq and Wet'suwet'en, and all different. We have different wants, needs, and aspirations, and people have to understand that. And the other thing I guess I would also echo is, don't ever get engaged internally in our internal discussions. So maybe in the Mi'kmaq, we don't all agree on stuff. That's for us to work out. We will work that out. That's how nations operate. Never ever go in to that, you know, internal debate or discussion and have a say over that, or say, oh, well, I support this person and not that person. Like, that's our role. So there's, you know, respectful roles for all of that. And, you know, the other thing I want to say is, this conversation also needs to be had with our youth. Sometimes we direct all the what can you do to settlers, but we need our youth in all of this too. We need all of our people, in fact. It's never too late to join. It's never too late to support. It's never too late to take action, no matter what your own particular skill is. I mean, you know, we will take you where you are. You don't have to be fluent in your language. You don't have to be a Sundance chief to be part of the resistance. You don't have to live on reserve. Maybe you were part of the 60s scoop. Maybe you were impacted. Maybe you were in youth corrections. Maybe you were in group homes. Maybe you were in prison. Maybe you've been in and out of prison. We need everybody. We have to learn to forgive ourselves for being colonized. We're all colonized. We all have been impacted by it, and come together and say, okay, but what unites us? What's going to get us moving forward? And so there is a place for everyone. And sometimes youth feel very disconnected. Maybe they don't have an elder that can help advise them. Maybe they've never been involved in the movement and they feel like there's no part for them. Well, we need every single warrior. Maybe you're the next Kanahus Manuel, who in 10 years is going to be the critical figure that stops something else that the settler governments are doing. And so that's why we need everybody. And I know it can be difficult, and sometimes we have issues amongst ourselves, but that's what relationships are about. We're like any family. families have difficulties and you just have to work that all out. So in addition to settlers having their role, I think it's important that our people need to see they have a role too, no matter where they are in this whole decolonization process, including if you're just starting out now, because that's what's going to make us so powerful.
Wow, loving all these answers. And I want to move us into the last question, which is a great segue. Pam, you started us off. What is your message to Indigenous viewers of this talk? What do you want to leave them with? Some closing thoughts, and we'll start with you, Doreen.
I just want to add to what a piece to the last question. I also think that settlers should be supporting our political initiatives by standing up for the land with us, and sometimes going and starting their own thing to stand up for the land, like the people at Burnaby, on Burnaby Mountain, were out there in full force getting arrested. That's what leadership does. They get arrested. They take it to the limit. They sacrifice themselves, and settlers need to start doing that too. They need to help pay for the lawyers of the people who are getting arrested, and they need to show up for the court cases and be in the courtroom. Today I was just listening to the news how Bonnie Henry had asked for an injunction against against churches, because churches were still meeting and congregating during COVID. And the judge turned it down. And I was like, what? So clergy have more right than Indigenous people. We try to stop injunctions because the corporations come in and ask for an injunction against us. So we cannot congregate to protest on our own territory. And they get the injunctions. They get the injunctions against us, so that if we show up to try to protest, we get arrested. Yet the clergy, are able to get away with not having an injunction against them for meeting at a time when we are so fearful, rightfully so fearful of COVID. To me, I'm still trying to process that thought, and I'm thinking, so clergy have more power and respect and protection than Indigenous people. Clergy. Anyways, what can youth do? Youth can get educated. Youth can read the books, the good books, the ones written by Indigenous authors that have real truth in them. And those are mostly the newer books. They can go on the land. There's been a lot of young people that have shown up at Tiny House Warriors and at the Wet'suwet'en camp. They go up there and they learn firsthand what's going on. When I was a youth back in the 70s, we traveled together. That's where I learned my power. We were a spiritual movement. We were in ceremonies and sweat lodges every weekend. And we were learning how to sing, like to really bring our power out, because there's a spirit in every song. There's a spirit in the drum. We were learning about all of the spirits that could walk with us, how to call our ancestors up to walk with us so that we would not walk with fear. We would walk with pride and dignity when we were, rallying. And there's just like so much to learn. Don't get stuck in a city if it's not feeding you, if there's not the right people surrounding you in that city to feed you, then go where you have to go. Go live on the land. I remember a time I traveled around with a little backpack just this big. It just had a change of clothes and my medicines in it. And I would go and I'd show up at, 4 a.m. after hitchhiking half the night and then walking for hours. I'd show up at wherever everybody was, and there'd be a fire raging, and I'd just lay down beside the fire. I'd wake up all covered with ashes, get up and go find the kitchen and start cooking and just be part of the circle. And that's where I found my strength from. People ask sometimes, how was George Manuel so strong? He never gave up. They ask me, how do I just keep going? And that's what it is. It's like the spirit, the ancestors looking into the eyes of a little child and knowing that's who I'm fighting for. That's who I have to keep going for. And then just continuing to go. you will get that spirit will come to you. And it might not be a ceremony. And this, some medicine man might not tell you what your spirit is, but you will earn that spirit. And once it comes inside of you, you will feel that strength and courage and power inside of yourself. And, that's why a lot of our youth give up, because they can't find their way to that. And we don't need a medicine person to carry you there. Back in the old days, not everybody was a medicine person. You got yourself across that line to the spirits and you made that connection yourself. Everybody has the ability to do that. So it's go out and find your power and get your education.
Thanks. Kanahus, what would your message be to the Indigenous viewers of this talk?
I would like to just really acknowledge all of our Indigenous viewers, because we're survivors, and we're survivors of this Holocaust and genocide that's been there to eliminate us. And our ancestors that survived were warriors to bring us this far, that we're here today. And I just, is it loud? Is it too loud with the puppies? You guys don't hear the puppies?
We can hear them a bit. You could put in your headphones, but we can hear you fine too.
Just interrupt for that. But yeah, I want to say specifically to the Indigenous youth is to really find your voice. And a lot of times to find your voice, sometimes you have to dive deep into yourself and deal with some of our healing and trauma that from our childhood, from colonization. But we can have the power to do it ourselves. Like, I believe that as Indigenous people, we can't be just searching out. We don't have access to medicine men and medicine women like we did in the past. And so we're going to have to really look to ourselves for this. And one of the things that I've done, just raising my 4 children as freedom babies and not registering them with the government, and really finding ways to be self-sufficient on my own self is something that I always, the words of advice that I leave to the youth is that we can do it for ourselves. So for so many years, while I was raising my children, just salmon and moose meat and berries and roots and just really eating traditional off the land. Like, it's not impossible, like some people may think. People are really dependent on the hospitals and the doctors, the white man's doctors. We can really be self-sufficient in ourselves by going back to our traditional medicines and everything. But yeah, I'm just going to end it at that. I just want to say thank you to all of our Indigenous people and our land defenders, specifically for standing up and fighting for our lands.
Thank you so much. Pam, do you have anything else you'd like to add to the Indigenous viewers?
Yeah, obviously, thank you. Thank you for everything you do. Thank you for being here. Every day is a victory. Just like every day on the ground, when we have victories every day, living and surviving is a victory. And we're so grateful for that, because we literally need every single person. And that means you're going to be able to contribute in different ways at different times. But just don't ever think that because you're not on the front lines that you are not contributing. Your survival is also contributing. And we can get important education from a wide variety of sources. You've got formal education, you've got traditional nation-based education, and then there's also life. I mean, I have learned so much from people who have survived the 60s scoop, who have survived prison, who have survived life on the streets. I mean, there are things that we all have, we can contribute. And the other thing I would say is, we need to embrace our old school traditions and the ways that we used to exercise our voice in constructive ways. Yes, it's entirely appropriate to say the way that the AFN is being led is not right. It's not helpful. It's running counter to our rights. That's okay. That's not lateral violence. That's not a personal attack. That's constructive criticism based on what the AFN has been doing with regards to the federal government. And we need to be okay with that. We can't let ourselves get into a space where constructive criticism and analysis and holding leaders to account is something that we shy away from because, oh, we shouldn't be doing that. On the flip side of things, it's also totally important to balance that with who is it that we're supporting? What is it that we're advocating for? And supporting the people that are making those sacrifices, on the ground or in the media or in the courts or in general advocacy. And understanding that we all come from this place of being colonized. So we have to really understand the importance of being critical because we need to warn our people about what's happening. But there's a balance to that where we also have to be putting our support somewhere and the people who are doing that work. And I'm just so thankful to be part of it. I am so thankful to be part of this panel. I'm so thankful to have been part of movements on the ground, part of my nation and all of the Indigenous peoples who are doing this important work. And, don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise. All of us in this make mistakes all the time. Let's just celebrate the day-to-day battles that we're winning, their survival. And, we got this. We got ourselves here and we will get ourselves over the hump and ultimately win the war.
Wow. This has been a fantastic conversation. I've learned a lot. I hope everyone has as well. I want to leave just a moment. If anyone has any final words they want to leave us with, any final thoughts? All right. Well, this has been fantastic. And thank you all so much for taking the time to speak and share your knowledge, share your wisdom, share your power. Let's support all of the panelists. Let's support our warriors, all the warriors on the ground. Let's get land back to Indigenous nations. And yeah, we'll have the links up to ways you can support. Once again, thank you so much to all our panelists.
I'll just add that another way that settlers can support is by buying copies of the book for young people. Like there's all kinds of youth centers across Canada buying like 50 or 100 copies and have them dropped off at the friendship centers or youth centers, because a lot of our own people can't even afford the few dollars that these books cost.
That's a great idea.
Yes, buy the books.
Buy the books. Okay, well, we'll end it there. And